This is a film about timpani in the classical period. In Baroque times, timpani were usually a luxury or novelty extra, and we were only involved in a very few pieces. But suddenly, Mozart, Haydn and Beethoven decided to include us regularly. For the first time we had a chance to claim a permanent place in the orchestra. Even in just the last minute of this overture, there were a few excellent examples of some of the new things that we simply wouldn't have been given to play just 30 years earlier. Before we dive into these, let's just remind ourselves about timpani playing in the Baroque period. In Baroque times, the kind of playing we had was quite narrow. We mostly appeared in choral music and always playing with the trumpets. Our role was often ceremonial or to add some splendour. Most of what we had to play was in some way fanfare-like. Of course, it's important to play to the highest possible standard, but perhaps we could say that we are taking part in great music, rather than taking a great part in the music. The classical period was all about expanding the range of sounds and colours in the orchestra, and that meant every instrument playing to its strengths and finding, on occasions, a unique and independent voice. This excerpt is from Cosi fan Tutte, and it's the overture this time, right at the beginning of the opera. You'll hear that the timpani has some syncopations, but actually they're syncopations on syncopations because the rest of the orchestra is already doing something else. I think you can instantly hear that there's something uncertain and cheeky about this opera because the timpani are playing directly out of time with everybody else. That was a very typical tonic and dominant rumbustious ending, and I think it sets up the evening of this opera perfectly, those quirky rhythms and that fantastic ending. From military and ceremonial roots, timpani were always closely partnered with the trumpets, and this would continue. It might be an unwelcome cliché that drums always play loudly, but actually, in Baroque times, that was largely the case. Drums of that time don't have a very clear sound or pitch, and this is perhaps why composers largely avoided giving us anything quiet or exposed to play. Here, timpani are used as an independent accompanying instrument, requiring new levels of technique, precision and sensitivity. Thinking back to those Baroque excerpts, another similarity they share is that they are all in the key of D, and the vast majority of our repertoire was, for over 100 years, in this one single key. You're about to see something that was very remarkable for timpani at this time. It's something that 99% of musicians do in 99% of the bars they play in. But so far, timpanists have done it extremely rarely, if ever. I'm about to change one of my notes. 3 movements of this symphony are in D, and so that means we play D and A, since A is the dominant note. Now that Haydn wants us to play in every movement, unless he wrote all of the movements in D, we need to be able to retune a drum or two. The second movement is in G, and so I need a G, and I keep the D, but that now becomes the dominant note. Although there's a break between movements, most conductors just want a brief pause and then carry on as soon as possible. And so I need to get pretty close to the new note immediately. The horn players need to change crooks, but the trumpet players have a second instrument ready and tuned. I've now got about 45 seconds before I need to play this G, but they've decided to start this movement with just 4 solo players. It's a lovely idea, but since it is essential for everyone to sit extremely still, this means I've now lost half of the remaining time. The first entry is loud and extremely exposed, and there's absolutely nowhere to hide. The question I most often get asked is why, quite regularly, I lean down over the head of the drum. Some of the more imaginative suggestions include smelling or kissing it, or having a snooze, but unfortunately the real answer is far less exciting. The only way you can know for sure what note any drum is tuned to is to tap it very lightly, or actually to very quietly sing the new note into the head, as it will vibrate back in sympathy. It's reasonable to wonder why I don't just use a third drum for the G and save all the stress of quick tuning. Of course this could work, but if I can, I'm keen to stick to the same pair of drums for the whole piece, as pairs of drums usually match each other the best. Now's probably a good time to talk about the drums I'm using. In most of these excerpts, I am playing drums likely to be of the size that were used at the time. The thick skins are lapped directly onto the hoops, which gives them a short decay and means they're very articulate and hardly need any damping. The other pair I'm using are a little bigger, in fact the smaller drum being virtually the same size as the large drum of the first pair. On these, the heads are lapped onto separate hoops. This means that you can use thinner heads if you want to, which gives the drums a clearer note and a longer decay. These drums are definitely quite modern sounding for this music, and actually a long decay isn't helpful here. But sometimes smaller drums don't work terribly well, particularly in opera pits with a dry acoustic, very large concert halls, or if we're playing with a relatively large orchestra. Nowadays we move timpani around far more than they did 200 years ago, and all changes in climatic conditions make it hard to ensure that the notes on small drums are reliable. Most of today's reproduction classical timpani have added T-shaped tuning handles. These are vital for quick changes compared to many Baroque drums, which often had a separate removable key, which was obviously much slower and quite noisy to use. The next excerpt needs similarly quick tuning, but this time I need to retune both notes. The fact that this tuning is during the music tells us exactly how much time there was, therefore helping us to understand more about the drums and players of the time. This excerpt is from Mozart's opera Cosi fan Tutte. It's right at the end of the opera, and in the last 25 minutes there are 5 different keys for the timpani to play in, which proves that they must have been able to tune the timpani quite quickly. I'll talk you through how I do it after I've played the first section. I start in C and G, the tonic in the key that we're in. And now I've got a G I can hear. I can check my G. Now I need to tune to an E flat and a B flat, and the music helpfully here goes into F. La, that's an F. I'm going to tune the B flat first, and if I sing an F into the B flat, you hear the B flat resonate. And now I'm going to get the E flat. La, 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 that's an E flat. And I'm going to use softer sticks for this because it's a more hymn-like section of music. I usually play with one hand because I still have to make micro adjustments in between the entries. We think that sticks of this time were almost exclusively thought to be wood, and these are by no means all the same, with weight making a huge difference to how clear or boomy a sound they give. When we have to play very loudly, then hard felt can sound exactly the same, but it is much less likely to cause damage or wear to the heads. As the range of styles of music we played in suddenly became much broader, I'm fairly sure that some timpanists would have experimented with various types of stick coverings. It only really makes sense to discuss sticks if you also talk about the size of timpani, the thickness of the drum heads, and the acoustic, as these factors will all greatly affect what the drums sound like. Since a drum can go out of tune by at least a third in just a few minutes, if it starts raining for example, our limited range of notes always had far more to do with the keys that the trumpets were able to play in. Adding keys was obviously appealing to composers, allowing them greater flexibility and increasing their options and choices of when to include us. Out of Haydn's first 80 symphonies, around a quarter of them have timpani parts. But when you look closer, you see that many of these are listed as optional or added later. Haydn began by considering that timpani did not have a vital role in his music, but now there's a piece with a role literally so vital that the piece is named after it. During this very short period, Mozart, Haydn and Beethoven produced an extraordinary amount of orchestral music, and the remarkable thing is that timpani are included in almost all of these pieces. It seems as though, when presented with new challenges and needing a greater musical understanding, timpanists of that time were showing that they were more than capable, and so these composers happily kept writing more and more. We probably need to thank just a small handful of very good players who convinced composers to keep writing for us, establishing timpani as a fundamental part of the orchestra and ensuring that future composers would maintain this. Beethoven studied with Haydn, and almost immediately there were signs that timpani would be very important for him. Rhythm dominates much of Beethoven, and from his very earliest works he used the clear and percussive drums of the day to great effect. Now, right at the end of this piece, there's a challenging new technique that Beethoven would use many more times in his later works. We call this crossing over. We need to play these notes with alternate hands as bounces wouldn't be loud enough, and the only way to do this is for our arms to cross over or very nearly cross over. Earlier, I mentioned the advantages of tuning taps. And so it's quite ironic that it's classical drums which are the ones that have these, when this is the style of music that has the most crossovers compared to Baroque, Romantic or modern music. The taps form a very unwelcome obstacle, and we need to think carefully of ways to avoid noisy accidents. Harmony was becoming more complicated, and it's important to clear up one curious characteristic of timpani at this time. Cadences or endings in music are usually made up of 3 chords. But timpani only came in pairs, and this presents a problem. If you've never been aware of it, this is probably a mixture of clever writing by the composer combined with sensitive playing. When we are in the tonic key, we are able to play the important notes, partly since the tonic note is part of the subdominant chord, and our notes enable us to play the most common cadence easily. But classical music often goes into the dominant key, and when there is a cadence in the dominant, we have a problem since we don't have the dominant of the dominant. We're constantly trying to play musically with our colleagues, and so it is quite a problem to work out how the timpani can join this harmonic line properly when the second most important note is completely missing. Here's another example from the Magic Flute Overture you heard at the beginning of this film. Here we are seeing that rather than timpani's role being solely as a rhythm or fanfare instrument, we're starting to have a split function also contributing to the bass department of the orchestra. Timpanists debate these issues at length, and some people feel a temptation to do Mozart and Haydn a favour by adding some missing notes, and this is particularly easy these days, either by having an extra drum or by using pedal timpani. But harmonic hierarchy is extremely important, and things such as our lesser contribution in the dominant key aren't necessarily a disadvantage. Thinking about the timpani changing from being a rhythm-only instrument, although this diagram is very simplistic, I think we could all agree that, of the last 200 years since Mozart, the way composers wrote for timpani shifted quite sizably towards harmony compared to rhythm. Important themes are obviously more commonly played by melodic instruments. Beethoven took his fascination with rhythm to another level by using very simple rhythms as powerful motifs, and these are perfectly suited to be played by the timpani. One of Beethoven's timpanists was called Ignaz Manka. He trained as a cellist, and it seems that this background could have been a vital influence as Beethoven developed how he wrote for timpani. First, here is the opening theme. And this is the end of a huge long cadenza of several minutes. The theme needs to be reintroduced for a final time to end the movement, and this wonderful moment of tension and drama is entrusted to the timpani. Orchestras in classical times generally did not have conductors. Although this is a piano concerto, even in symphonies the orchestra would have been directed from the piano or by the leader. With a clear, front-loaded sound, the drummer in any band helps everyone stay together, and the timpanist of an orchestra like this can be very helpful, particularly when the pianist is rather busy. We've had the drum roll symphony, and now we have the Paukenmass. With references to battle, the timpani here are surely meant to mimic an army-style drum, where pitch isn't as important, but a short dry sound is. The added gels in the centre of the drums change their sound to make it shorter, and this is especially useful in an enormous acoustic. Given how controlled and reliable the player must be, and the fact that this solo goes on for so long, shows that the timpanists of the day must have been of the highest ability to be given such a fundamental role in such an important and atmospheric movement of this piece. All of the music you've heard in this film was composed within just 13 years. But now we'll jump forward very slightly to give a glimpse of how Beethoven and others continue to take timpani forwards. This excerpt has almost everything new we've looked at. It's an independent solo, it's in the new key of E flat, and it uses a range of dynamics and is based on the movement's rhythmic motif. We need to be musical, controlled and extremely reliable.